Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. After touring a Pfizer plant in Michigan on Friday, February 19th, Uncle Joe Biden said we needed Congress to pass his American Rescue Plan that spends $1.9 trillion allegedly dealing with the coronavirus crisis. And he criticized those who said that amount is too much. And he asked what we would have him cut. Well, he didn't want an answer to that question, but I'm going to give him one. I spent the last 3 days, probably cumulatively, I bet it was close to 40 hours over those 3 days, maybe more, reading the 591-page bill titled the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, taking notes on what it said and doing some additional research to try to decipher some of the government gobbledygook to figure out what was really going on. So this is what Uncle Joe said.
We need Congress to pass my American Rescue Plan that deals with the immediate crisis, the urgency. Now, critics say my plan is too big, that it costs $1.9 trillion. So that's too much. Well, let me ask them, what would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out?
Joe, this is my answer. I know you don't want to hear it, but here it goes. Take out what's on page 9, $4 billion in farm subsidies. That's in addition to the existing normal $10 billion in farm subsidies and the $35 billion in emergency aid to farmers in last year's COVID relief bills and the billions in PPP money that farmers were also given in 2020. Now, I understand all the arguments about why farmers need subsidies. Some of them make sense, some do not. But despite the coronavirus, American farmers in aggregate, it's not universal, but in aggregate, total U.S. farm income in 2020 would have been about average compared with the last 20 years, without the extra government aid. And with the massive government aid, 2020 was the 5th most profitable year for American farmers since 1975.
What would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out?
How about you cut what's on page 18? $1.01 billion for the Secretary of Agriculture to, and I'm quoting here, provide outreach, mediation, financial training, capacity building training, cooperative development training and support, and other technical assistance to socially disadvantaged groups, and to provide grants and loans to improve land access for socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, or forest landowners. Note that socially disadvantaged is not the same as financially disadvantaged.
What would they have me leave out?
How about you leave out $800 million appropriated on page 21 for food in foreign countries? That $800 million does not buy food for a single American. That is $800 million buying food for non-Americans, overseas, elsewhere, not within our borders. How about you cut that, Joe?
What would they have me leave out?
Well, how about you leave out what's on page 22, $1.135 billion for grants to states who see increases in the SNAP program. That's food stamps. It's now called Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
What would they have me cut?
How about cutting the $128.55 billion on page 26 that funds grants to states for education with no requirement whatsoever that those states actually have any on-campus learning activities?
What would they have me cut?
Joe, you should cut the $39.584 billion appropriated on page 28 for institutions of higher education through the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund of the Education Stabilization Fund for financial aid grants. Not loans, these are grants to the tune of $39.584 billion.
What would they have me cut?
Where should you cut? How about what's on page 36? an $850 million slush fund for the Secretary of Education to allocate awards to schools, quote, on the basis of their respective needs as determined by the Secretary, end quote. In other words, wherever the Secretary wants it to go, okay with Congress, $850 million slush fund. That's all that is.
What would they have me cut?
Well, Joe, you can also cut the $850 million for the Secretary of Education to allocate to education programs funded by the Bureau of Indian Education. So we have Indian schools getting $850 million, and we have non-Indian schools getting $850 million. In both cases, they're slush funds.
What would they have me cut?
Well, here's another cut for you, Joe. Page 37. $19.25 million earmarked specifically to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Now, remember that Gallaudet University already got an earmark of $7 million in the spring 2020 COVID relief bill. Why do they need another $19.25 million?
What would they have me cut?
Well, here's another cut for you, Joe. Also a university earmark. Page 38, $35 million earmarked specifically to Howard University, which you might recall got $13 million in the spring 2020 COVID relief bill. Well, now they're going to get another $35 million.
What would they have me cut?
Looking for a place to cut? Page 41, $135 million to the National Endowment for the Arts. What does that have to do with the coronavirus?
What would they have me leave out?
Well, Joe, you can't give money to the National Endowment for the Arts without also giving it to the National Endowment for the Humanities. So on page 42, there's $135 million for them, too. How about you cut that?
What would they have me cut?
Well, you could cut the $200 million for the Institute of Museum and Library Services that's appropriated on page 43.
What would they have me leave out?
I would suggest you leave out the $10 million appropriation on page 44 to fund the preservation and maintenance of Native American languages. Now, let's assume for the sake of this discussion that preserving Native American languages is a good thing. And let's assume that it's something the federal government should pay for. Well, it's already been funded since 2006 via the Esther Martinez Native American Languages Programs Act, which was extended in 2019 to provide $13 million each year through 2024. So this $10 million is an additional $10 million. For what? The bill doesn't specify. And for the record, I had never heard of the Esther Martinez Native American Languages Programs Act until I read the coronavirus bill and did some research into its history.
What would they have me leave out?
How about you leave out the $14.99 billion on page 67 for child care and development block grants? It's not the role of the federal government to pay for people's child care.
What would they have me cut?
Well, here's a good place to cut, Joe. Page 68. $23.975 billion for what Democrats call child care stabilization funding, which is another kind of child care and development block grant. Why that was listed separately and wasn't combined with the other $14.99 billion into a single $38.965 billion appropriation, I do not know. The bill didn't say, and I didn't have time to look into it any further.
What would they have me leave out?
Leave out what's on page 76, Joe. $1 billion in additional funding for the Head Start program.
What would they have me cut?
What would I have you cut? The $250 million on page 81 to prevent child abuse. Now, it doesn't specify exactly how $250 million will do that, of course, but this is Washington, D.C., so if I don't want that money to be spent, then I must want children to be abused, right? I mean, there could be no other explanation for an objection to that appropriation. Now, can there be?
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the $4.5 billion Congress is appropriating to pay utility bills for low-income families. Why should the federal government be paying utility bills for anybody? except obviously government buildings.
What would they have me cut?
What would I have you cut? The $425 million that page 83 gives the Secretary of Health and Human Services to disperse however he deems appropriate, or to use the exact words in the bill, however the Secretary determines necessary. It's a $425 million slush fund. Oh, but there's no place to cut now, is there?
What would they have me leave out?
What should you leave out, Joe? How about the $390 million on page 90 in additional funding for the WIC program, Women, Infant, and Children? Remember, this program is already funded to the tune of tens of billions of dollars elsewhere in the budget.
What would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out?
Oh, I'm just getting started. Let's take a break, and when we get back, I'll tell Uncle Joe what else he can cut in this ridiculous bill. When the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So Joe Biden asked this question about the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill that he wants passed.
Critics say my plan is too big, that it costs $1.9 trillion. So that's too much. Well, let me ask them, what would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out?
I'd leave out page 127, Joe. The $1 billion for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for what the bill calls vaccine confidence activities. In other words, the taxpayers will be spending $1 billion on advertising.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the $750 million on page 133 for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to combat COVID globally, including global immunizations. Why must the United States always pay for these things? How much is China spending to combat the disease they created globally? How much is China paying for global immunizations? And by the way, this appropriation is in addition to what we've already spent on this and allocated elsewhere in the budget.
What would they have me leave out?
Leave out the $330 million on page 140 to give $10,000 pay raises to medical students who are serving in residency through September 30th, 2023.
What would they have me cut?
You can cut the $50 million on page 144 to fund family planning, which may or may not include abortions. The bill doesn't go into much detail. In fact, that section was only 8 lines, which compared to the rest of the bill was barely a mention.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the $1.75 billion on page 150 to fund mental health and substance abuse. Then the next page, page 151, appropriates another $1.75 billion in block grants for the prevention and treatment of substance abuse. And yes, that is an additional appropriation. I did not count the same $1.75 billion twice.
What would they have me leave out?
Leave out page 156, Joe. $30 million to pay for what the bill calls, quote, overdose prevention programs, syringe services programs, and other harm reduction services with respect to harms of drug misuse that are exacerbated by the COVID-19 public health emergency, end quote. So apparently, if you lost your job because your idiot governor shut down your state for a disease with a survival rate of 98.214%, and you're so depressed over that you need to shoot illegal drugs into your veins to cope, the Democrats are about to spend $30 million in taxpayer money to buy you clean needles to do it. And then page 158 appropriates an additional $30 million to fund a program called Project Aware that also deals with drug addiction. Keep in mind, that program, too, is already funded in the federal budget.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the $20 million on page 158, Joe. It is there to fund youth suicide prevention. And while it would certainly be nice to reduce or eliminate youth suicides, how is throwing money at the problem going to solve it? Wouldn't it be more effective to let those depressed kids go back to school, be among their friends, and not be constantly told how horrible America is and how they have no future? How will $20 million prevent a youth suicide death? I don't know. But the Democrats are going to spend $20 million to find out.
What would they have me cut?
You can cut the $20 million on page 160 that is appropriated to upgrade the websites for Obamacare exchanges. I don't see why that's necessary, Joe.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the appropriation on page 202, $100 million to fund what the bill calls pollution and disparate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then goes on to explain that the Environmental Protection Agency needs to dole out the money to address health outcome disparities from pollution and the COVID-19 pandemic and implement environmental justice objectives described in Joe Biden's Executive Order 12898 that called for federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations, as well as tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. Did you hear those last two words? And abroad. $100 million.
What would they have me leave out?
Leave out page 203, which appropriates $4.5 billion in additional funding for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Act. Now, if that appropriation sounds familiar to you, it's because I already mentioned it. When I read it on page 203, I thought to myself, wasn't that program funded earlier? So I went back and looked, and sure enough, page 81 also had $4.5 billion to pay utility bills for low-income families. So is this a duplicate appropriation? Are poor families actually getting $9 billion? I think so. It's not explicitly clear, but the two sections make no reference to each other. So I think both appropriations will happen, which means it's really a $9 billion appropriation. Was that done to deliberately hide the money? Or was it a negligent double entry? I don't know. But it sure looks like you'll be paying $9 billion, not $4.5 billion, to pay other people's electric bills. And keep in mind that the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program is already funded elsewhere in the federal budget. This is extra money to the tune of $9 billion in extra money.
What would they have me cut?
How about cutting the $500 million on page 204 to pay people's past due water and sewer bills? Seriously, look it up. That's why I'm giving you these page numbers. Don't automatically believe what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is accurate, but I really want you to look it up and verify it. Like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. I'm giving you the page numbers so you can verify that what I'm telling you is correct.
What would they have me cut?
You can cut the $7.599 billion appropriated on page 210 to build high-speed internet services in rural communities. Funding for that appropriation includes, but is not limited to, paying for Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, devices that combine a modem and router, and connected devices. And that connected devices means computers, tablets, cell phones, and maybe even televisions. The wording in the bill simply states that if a device connects to the internet, it can be paid for with your tax dollars. You know, Tesla electric cars are all connected to the internet. I wonder if Uncle Sam will buy poor and rural people Teslas. I doubt it, but whether they do or not, the bill does seem to authorize it.
What would they have me leave out?
Here's another biggie you can leave out, Joe. Page 219. $19.05 billion to pay people's rent for up to 18 months. But it's not just rent itself, because the bill goes on to list eligible expenses the government will pay. And that list says, and I'm reading directly from it, 1, rent, 2, rental arrears, 3, utilities and home energy costs, 4, utilities and home energy costs arrears, and 5, other expenses related to housing. Other expenses related to housing? What does that mean? The bill doesn't define it. But wait, there's more. Page 230 goes on to fund what they call emergency housing vouchers to the tune of another $5 billion. And page 234 allocates a $10 million slush fund for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to dole out in no-bid contracts to whoever he wants, as long as it's intended to provide an increase in public housing capacity. And for whatever reason, the bill sets aside $100 million specifically for rental assistance in rural housing assistance, and $750 million in tribal housing assistance. Why those couldn't be included in the $19.05 billion in general rental assistance, I don't know. But rural communities and Indian reservations are getting their own $850 million set aside. But wait, this is government money. There's always more. Page 235 allocates $455 million for housing block grants for Native American housing and Native Hawaiian housing. Oh, and page 239 appropriates $100 million to pay for housing counseling. Presumably, that's to pay people to tell people what they need to do to get their piece of that roughly $25.4 billion total housing assistance. But that $25.4 billion does not include the $9 billion for the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. The bill also allocates an additional $5 billion for even more tenant-based rental assistance and housing for the homeless. Are you upset because you own a home, so you're not a renter and you feel left out? Well, stick around, because there's money in this bill for you. I'll tell you what it is when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So I have read all 591 pages of what Congress has titled the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which is the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill. And Joe Biden asked his critics where he should cut. Now, he wasn't really wanting an answer, but I'm giving him one. Right before going to that break, I went through what renters get. Well, if you're a homeowner, not to worry, the Democrats want to buy your loyal vote also. Page 246 appropriates $9.961 billion for a homeowner assistance fund that will help pay homeowners' expenses too. What kind of expenses, you ask? Well, the bill lists them on pages 249 and 250. And this is what it says are qualified homeowner expenses the government will pay to prevent homeowner mortgage delinquencies, defaults, foreclosures, loss of utilities or home energy services, and displacements of homeowners experiencing financial hardship after January 21, 2020. Ready? I'll read it directly from the bill. Mortgage payment assistance. Financial assistance to allow a homeowner to reinstate a mortgage or to pay other housing-related costs related to a period of forbearance, delinquency, default. Principal reduction. Facilitating interest rate reductions. Payment assistance for utilities, including electric, gas, and water. Internet service, including broadband internet access service. Property taxes. Homeowners insurance, flood insurance, mortgage insurance, and homeowners association, condominium association fees, or common charges. And then the very nebulous any other assistance to promote housing stability for homeowners, including preventing eviction, mortgage delinquency, default, foreclosure, or the loss of utility or home energy services as determined by the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And the government will pay those through September 30th, 2025. And no, you did not mishear me. I did say September 30th, 2025. That's for the next 4.5 years. What are the eligibility requirements? Well, the bill didn't specify. The bill leaves a lot of interpretation up to the Secretary of the Department.
What would they have me leave out?
What would I have you leave out, Joe? Page 262. This is where small businesses get relief. The bill allocates $10 billion for small business assistance. But there's a caveat. Not every small business will be eligible. This $10 billion is specifically for, quote, business enterprises owned and controlled by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. What demographic is considered by Democrats to be socially disadvantaged? Minorities, of course. They've been oppressed by the white male patriarchal system for so long that they get special treatment by the government to make up for it. So if you're a white guy and you want some assistance for your business, well, too bad. You're not going to get it under the socially disadvantaged category. Maybe you'll be eligible under the economically disadvantaged category. But if you're a wealthy minority, it looks like you can get help based on the history of systemic oppression against you, even if you yourself are doing just fine. But that's not all. Page 265 instructs the program secretary to set aside $1 billion for an incentive program for, and I'm reading it straight from the bill, quote, states that demonstrate robust support, as determined by the secretary, for business concerns owned and controlled by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals in the deployment of prior allocation amounts, end quote. In other words, if poor people and minorities get the lion's share of the slop in the trough, then they can get even more in bonus money. This requirement is just another sick example of how Democrats always judge people not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. It's disgraceful. Now, just in case you think I'm speculating as to what is meant by socially disadvantaged individuals, I looked up the Small Business Administration's definition, because that's who would be administering this program. And the SBA defines it as, quote, individuals who have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias within American society because of their identities as members of groups and without regard to their individual qualities, and the social disadvantage must stem from circumstances beyond their control. The following groups of individuals are deemed to be socially disadvantaged: Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, Subcontinent Asian Americans, end quote. It didn't specify what percentage of those races one must be, but I'm sure that's factored in somewhere. And it makes no distinction between rich people of color and poor people of color. Skin color is the criteria. So Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama, and Shaquille O'Neal would be eligible for government assistance that your middle-class white business owner would not be. Seriously. If you don't believe me, look it up. I've given you the page numbers. It's very easy.
What would they have me cut?
Well, you could cut the welfare for the airlines. Page 280 appropriates $14 billion for airlines. Their contractors are getting $1 billion. So that's $15 billion to the airlines. And that doesn't include the $800 million appropriated on page 367 to pay the expenses of airport stores that are suffering due to lower sales as a result of the coronavirus. Nor does it include the $3 billion appropriated on page 377 that gives money to aviation manufacturing companies who are not manufacturing as many aircraft and aircraft parts as they used to. So have I gone through enough places we can cut, Joe? I'm not done yet. The biggies are coming up when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Uncle Joe Biden wants to know where we can cut from his $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill. What was the question again, Joe?
We need Congress to pass my American Rescue Plan that deals with the immediate crisis, the urgency. Now, critics say my plan is too big, that it costs $1.9 trillion. So that's too much. Well, let me ask them, what would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out?
Well, pages 283 through 304 are a place for big cuts, Uncle Joe. Those pages describe the $350 billion federal government bailout of fiscally irresponsible cities and states who were in dire financial straits long before the coronavirus hit. Congress will give those irresponsible states a whopping $219.8 billion, and the irresponsible cities a whopping $130.2 billion. That adds up to $350 billion. Now, the bill does say it is to, quote, mitigate the fiscal effects stemming from the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, end quote. But since it allows cities and states to use the money to, quote, cover costs incurred as a result of such emergency, meaning the pandemic, replace revenue that was lost, delayed, or decreased as a result of such emergency, or, and this is the overly broad kicker, quote, address the negative economic impacts of such emergency, end quote. Well, this pandemic has caused city and state tax revenues to plunge. So the federal government will simply be giving cities and states what their own taxpayers haven't. And cities and states who have irresponsibly not cut their budgets accordingly won't have to. Washington will simply give them the money to go merrily along the way as if nothing bad ever happened. Pensions for city and state employees? Yeah, Washington will fund those too. There's no need to bring those programs in line with what is actuarially sound. Don't worry about that. The Democrats have your back on this. So states like California, New York, and Illinois, and it's not limited to just them, they can continue to pay people more money in retirement than they paid them while they were working. And while some of this money will go to the more fiscally responsible Republican-controlled states like Florida, do not be misled. The lion's share will be going to fiscally irresponsible Democrat-run cities and states.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the appropriation on page 305, which is $570 million to pay for employees of the federal government to not work. Seriously. The bill says that $570 million is to be used for payment to an agency for the use of paid leave by any employee of the agency who is unable to work due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, maybe I don't understand how paid leave for federal government employees works, but if their salaries and benefits have already been appropriated elsewhere in the federal budget, then why would it cost an additional $570 million if they're not at work? The money's not to pay for temporary replacement workers. This is additional money to pay for the employee's leave. What am I missing? Normal leave already pays people to not work during the leave or vacation. Why would it take $570 million extra dollars just because that leave is related to the coronavirus? If they're not at work but still getting paid, then they're not at work but still getting paid. It doesn't cost extra money for an employee to go on leave. That leave's already in the budget. This makes no sense to me. But I've also never worked for the federal government, or any government for that matter. So my perspective is that of private sector employment. And yeah, I know the rules are quite different. Government pay and benefits far exceed what most of the private sector offers.
What would they have me leave out?
Well, Joe, how about you leave out pages 309 through 343, which modify and extend the Paycheck Protection Program, plus fund other small business programs. It totals $48.5 billion. It consists of $7.25 billion in further PPP funding. That's on page 319. $15 billion appropriated on page 323 for hard-hit small businesses. $25 billion for restaurants. That's appropriated on page 329. And then there's $1.25 billion for shuttered venues on page 342.
What would they have me leave out?
You can leave out the $13.48 billion appropriation that's going to the VA, because that's on top of its current budget of $243 billion, which was a 12% increase over last year's VA budget, and that doesn't include the $17.2 billion for Veterans Health that was in the 2020 COVID relief bill last spring.
What would they have me cut?
You can cut 21 pages of crazy expanded unemployment benefits that begin with page 400. Washington will give people additional unemployment benefits as it extends eligibility from 50 weeks to 74 weeks. 74 weeks, that's almost a year and a half of paying people to not work. And those unemployed people will receive a flat $400 federal bonus on top of whatever the states are already paying them. And they'll get that through August 29th. The national average for state unemployment benefits is $317 a week. But add to that the $400 federal bonus, and that means the average unemployed person in America will receive $717 a week to not work. Divide that by 40 hours, and it comes to $17.93 an hour to not work. It's crazy. Oddly, the bill does not specify how much that will cost. But just the federal portion of $400 per week for 24 weeks times the 18.3 million people currently collecting unemployment benefits totals $175.7 billion.
What would they have me cut?
Well, Joe, you can cut this. Page 454 begins the description of what the politicians call stimulus checks, but the bill calls recovery rebates to individuals. The federal government will give away free money in the amounts of $1,400 per person to everyone earning less than $75,000 individually or $150,000 as a married couple. And that income cap is based on your 2019 tax return, unless you've already filed for 2020, in which case 2020s would be used. Plus, there's $1,400 for each dependent also. 84% of Americans would receive full payments, and 6.8% would receive partial payments. And none of that 90.8% of Americans have to ask for it or demonstrate any financial hardship whatsoever. This giveaway is not means tested. It's not based upon a job loss or an adverse economic situation at all. It's just free money. Congress is giving away free money as if money was free. But of course, money is not free. The cost of giving away all that money is $422 billion. And that's just the appropriation. It doesn't include the enormous cost to the American people in the form of future inflation, higher interest rates, higher taxes, and a lower standard of living. And perhaps even the total collapse of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency and petrodollar. And if that ever happens, it would make the Great Depression look like the good old days. But very few people seem to care. And since Congress is giving away what people think is free money, what's another $110 billion in child tax credits piled on top of it all, huh? Page 475 begins the description of how the child tax credit will be expanded by raising the credit from $2,000 per kid 16 and younger to $3,600 per kid under the age of 6 and $3,000 per child 6 and over, and increasing the age that qualifies by 1 year from 16 to 17. But that's not the best part. And by best, I really mean worst. Instead of the tax credit, which you get even if you pay zero taxes, so if your tax bill is zero but you have 2 kids, you'll get between $6,000 and $7,200. But instead of getting that in one lump sum with your tax refund, the Democrats want to send it to you in 12 monthly payments. That way you'll be reminded that freebies come from government, and if you'll just keep electing Democrats, those monthly checks will keep showing up. Now, the bill doesn't specify the cost of the giveaway, but it's estimated to cost $110 billion. And the IRS will be getting $397 million additional dollars just to administer it. What part of administering the child tax credit could possibly cost $397 million?
What would they have me cut?
Well, Joe, page 498 begins the description of how the cash welfare payments called earned income tax credits will nearly triple and can be given to people as young as 19, down from the current 26. That cost to the U.S. Treasury? $12 billion.
What would they have me cut?
You could cut page 588, Joe. It appropriates $3.55 billion to pay for employee child care. Because why should the employee pay for someone to watch his or her kids while they're at work, huh? Isn't that what the government is for? Note the sarcasm if you didn't already. And every one of those appropriations for giveaway programs is accompanied by a corresponding appropriation to pay for the government to administer them. I didn't keep a running total of those administrative costs, but it's in the billions. So, Uncle Joe, you asked what should be cut from the so-called COVID relief bill. Well, on today's program, I just came up with $1.441 trillion in cuts. I saved you 75.84% of what you and your Democrat ilk are about to spend. By the way, it's going to happen through the budget reconciliation process, which is exempt from the filibuster. So don't count on Republicans to stop it. Not that they would. Republicans these days are just as eager to waste your money as the Democrats are. It is truly disgraceful. We are out of time for today's program, but that's probably a good thing, because if we had more time, I would probably make you even angrier than you are right now. Making you angry was not my goal. My goal was telling you the truth. Because if you're like me, you would rather know something bad that is true than believe something good that is false. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.